Now, Matt Campbell is an unusual seeker of the truth to do with 9/11, because there's a lot of 9/11 stuff out there, but Matt lost his brother, as you will hear, very tragically in the fall of the towers. But that gives Matt certain powers legally, being a family member, to find out what actually happened on 9/11. And I think most of us in this room know we have still not yet found out what really happened on 9/11. And it's something we've discussed many times here, but this takes a more personal angle. And we're going to find out today how Matt's quest for the truth is uncovering things that may yet go to make a bigger difference. So we've got a very brave man here, and I want you to give a massive round of applause for Mr. Matt Campbell.
My name is Matt Campbell. My brother Jeff was one of 67 British victims who were murdered on September 11, 2001. I last saw him at the end of August 2001 when he came back to the UK on holiday from New York with his new fiancée Caroline, a girl from Boston he had met since moving to Manhattan in 1999. The World Trade Center was not my brother's usual place of work. A lot of British victims, 10 in total, were at the top of the North Tower at a conference organised by a British company called Risk Waters. Of the 10 victims, 8 were employees and 2 were conference attendees. On 9/11, Jeff was one of those attendees, and this clip is probably the last seconds of his life. Whether you believe in the official narrative of 9/11 or you subscribe to a particular county conspiracy theory, please keep an open mind during my presentation. Please also remember what I present here is a very small subset of the information which runs counter to the official narrative. I hope you'll understand when my hour is up that I could have called this talk the absence of remains, or the absence of evidence, or the absence of truth. But in the end, I settled on the absence of justice. Because ultimately, all the victims of 9/11 and their families have not had anything remotely like justice, and that absence of justice has led to the war on terror and the death of hundreds and thousands of servicemen and women, and millions of innocent Iraqi and Afghan men, women and children. As Ken O'Keefe says, truth, justice, peace. But first, let us refresh ourselves of the official narrative of 9/11. My apologies if some of you have seen this before. It's from the excellent Corbett report.
On the morning of September 11, 2001, 19 men armed with box cutters, directed by a man on dialysis in a cave fortress halfway around the world, using a satellite phone and a laptop, directed the most sophisticated penetration of the most heavily defended airspace in the world, overpowering the passengers and the military combat-trained pilots on 4 commercial aircraft before flying those planes wildly off course for over an hour without being molested by a single fighter interceptor. These 19 hijackers, devout religious fundamentalists who like to drink alcohol, snort cocaine, and live with pink-haired strippers, managed to knock down 3 buildings with 2 planes in New York. While in Washington, a pilot who couldn't handle a single-engine Cessna was able to fly a 757 in an 8,000-foot descending 270-degree corkscrew turn to come exactly level with the ground, hitting the Pentagon in the Budget Analyst Office where DoD staffers were working on the mystery of the $2.3 trillion that Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld had announced missing from the Pentagon's coffers in a press conference the day before, on September 10, 2001. Luckily, the news anchors knew who did it within minutes.
Osama bin Laden.
The pundits knew within hours.
Osama bin Laden.
The administration knew within the day.
Terrorists who committed these acts and those who harbored them.
And the evidence literally fell into the FBI's lap.
That a hijacker's passport was found blocks from the World Trade Center crash site, if you can believe that.
But for some reason, a bunch of crazy conspiracy theorists demanded an investigation into the greatest attack on American soil in history. That investigation was delayed, underfunded, set up to fail, a conflict of interest, and a cover-up from start to finish. It was based on testimony extracted through torture, the records of which were destroyed. It failed to mention the existence of WTC-7, Able Danger, P-TECH, Sibel Edmonds, OBL and the CIA, and the drills of hijacked aircraft being flown into buildings that were being simulated at the precise same time that those events were actually happening. It was lied to by the Pentagon, the CIA, the Bush administration, and as for Bush and Cheney, well, no one knows what they told it because they testified in secret, off the record, not under oath, and behind closed doors. It didn't bother to look at who funded the attacks because that question is ultimately of little practical significance. Still, the 9/11 Commission did brilliantly answering all of the questions the public had, except most of the victims' family members' questions, and pinned blame on all the people responsible, although no one so much as lost their job, determining the attacks were
failure of imagination.
Because
Nobody in our government, at least, and I don't think the prior government that could envision flying airplanes into buildings.
except the Pentagon, FEMA, NORAD, and the NRO. The DIA destroyed 2.5 terabytes of data on Able Danger, but that's okay because it probably wasn't important. The SEC destroyed their records on the investigation into the insider trading before the attacks, but that's okay because destroying the records of the largest investigation in SEC history is just part of routine record keeping. NIST has classified the data that they used for their model of WTC-7's collapse, but that's okay because knowing how they made their model of the collapse would jeopardize public safety. The FBI has argued that all material related to their investigation of 9/11 should be kept secret from the public, but that's okay because the FBI probably has nothing to hide. This man never existed, nor is anything he had to say worthy of your attention, and if you say otherwise, you are a paranoid conspiracy theorist and deserve to be shunned by all of humanity. Likewise him, and her. And her, and her, and him. Osama bin Laden lived in a cave fortress in the hills of Afghanistan, but somehow got away. Then he was hiding out in Tora Bora, but somehow got away. Then he lived in Abbottabad for years, taunting the most comprehensive intelligence dragnet employing the most sophisticated technology in the history of the world for a decade, releasing video after video with complete impunity and getting younger and younger as he did so, before finally being found in a daring SEAL team raid which wasn't recorded on video, in which he didn't resist or use his wife as a human shield, and in which these crack special forces operatives panicked and killed this unarmed man, supposedly the best source of intelligence about those dastardly terrorists on the entire planet. Then they dumped his body in the ocean before telling anyone about it. Then a couple dozen of that team's members died in a helicopter crash in Afghanistan. This is the story of 9/11, brought to you by the media which told you the hard truths about...
His head could be seen to move violently forward.
And...
They took the babies out of the incubators.
And...
Mobile production facilities.
And...
The rescue of Jessica Lynch.
If you have any questions about this story, you are a batshit, paranoid, tinfoil, dog-abusing baby hater and will be reviled by everyone. If you love your country and or freedom, happiness, rainbows, rock and roll, puppy dogs, apple pie, and your grandma, you will never ever express doubts about any part of this story to anyone. Ever. This has been a public service announcement by the Friends of the FBI, CIA, NSA, DIA, SEC, MSM, White House, NIST, and the 9/11 Commission. Because ignorance is strength.
So let's first look at the absence of remains at the World Trade Center. These are the operational statistics as of April this year. A total of 2,753 people were reported missing at World Trade, and a total of 21,905 body parts had been recovered. The majority of people have been identified through their DNA extracted from bones. Only 15 people were identified from viewing remains alone. A staggering 1,113, that's 40% of the people who reported missing at World Trade have had no remains identified, none whatsoever. Over the past 3.5 years, there have only been 5 new identifications. They are still identifying remains at a rate of about 30 to 50 per month, but these are further remains of people already identified. For a lot of families, the hope of being reunited with their loved ones is looking more and more remote as the years pass. We were told it was unlikely any remains would be found on my brother. In the weeks and months after 9/11, we started to hear a very strange term, vaporised, when the police and the authorities talked about the World Trade Center victims. At the time, we didn't really think what vaporised meant. However, in June 2002, around my mother's birthday, we received a call from the police. Jeff's collarbone had been found. Mum got a lot of comfort from the return of his collarbone because he broke it as a toddler. We didn't know what to do with it, so it stayed in my house in the casket. And then in July 2004, we had another call from the police. 3 more bone fragments had been identified: his scapula, his sacrum, and his femur. I found it almost impossible to identify the bone fragments as once being my brother. We had them repatriated and we had a burial. And then 4 years later, in 2008, we had another call from the police to say further remains had been identified. Although we knew what was in the casket, nothing really prepared my mum and me when we opened the bags the remains were sealed in. My mum let out a gasp when she opened her eyes. This was once her son. I'm a parent. I don't know how you handle this kind of thing. It was his scalp with hair, ear, facial skin, some facial bones, and his right jaw with 3 teeth. My mother was relieved more than anything that there was no sign of him being burned. We had a second burial in 2008. Now, the repatriation of his remains in 2004 actually triggered the opening of an inquest in the UK, but it was immediately adjourned. Adjournment is common with all inquests. It's to allow time for investigations to be conducted and reports to be prepared. Nearly 10 years later, on January 29, 2013, we finally had an inquest, which was held into the deaths of 10 of the 67 British victims who'd had remains repatriated, 4 of whom were at the conference that Jeff attended. The coroner relied heavily on the 9/11 Commission investigation and report. I tried to obtain a copy of the report DS Nigel Levitt, who's from Counter-Terrorism Command, had prepared for the coroner. The Freedom of Information Act was denied. And they said, I have ascertained that the report prepared for the coroner may well be within the papers relating to this operation. Unfortunately, due to the size of operation, I'm unable to assist you. She stated that there are over 363 boxes of files in storage relating to Operation Exchange, which may or may not contain the report to the coroner by DS Nigel Levitt. She cited costs as a reason not to search for the record. We're not talking about some information buried on a specific post-it note in amongst, hundreds of boxes. It's the summary of the investigation, an official document and report prepared for the coroner. Anyway, I know from contacting DI Howard Way, who actually gave evidence at the inquest, that the report is marked exempt from disclosure. So I'm never going to get it anyway. Oh, sorry. Hey. The inquest lasted less than 2 hours for all 10 victims, of which only 3 minutes was spent dealing with my brother's death. This is what the coroner concluded. At 8:46 on 11 September 2001, the deceased was on the 106th floor of the North Tower of the World Trade Center when an aircraft, American Airlines 11, was deliberately flown into the building, causing its collapse at 10:28. This event was part of a coordinated attack by the Islamist militant group Al-Qaeda. Let's take a closer look at perhaps the most important conclusion. The perpetrators are part of Al-Qaeda. For these are the people who allegedly hijacked 4 planes on 9/11 and ultimately are held responsible for the death of nearly 3,000 people. Okay, firstly, let's have a look at the alleged mastermind of the attacks, Osama bin Laden. The late Robin Cook, former Foreign Secretary, had this to say in The Guardian a day after the London bombings in 2005. Throughout the 80s, he was armed by the CIA and funded by the Saudis to wage jihad against the Russian occupation of Afghanistan. Now, some allege he wasn't just a CIA asset, but rather an agent of the CIA. Either way, for several years prior to 9/11, he became America's #1 boogeyman. Within 30 minutes of the 9/11 attacks, CBS News named Osama bin Laden as a suspect. Within 24 hours, he was officially linked to the attacks by the Bush administration and a willing, obedient mainstream media. Let's look at some of the statements made by the US authorities in the weeks after 9/11 regarding who was behind the attacks. September 26, 2001, Paul Wolfowitz, Deputy Secretary of Defence, was asked what the findings are in regard to evidence linking Osama bin Laden or other terrorists that you might think were behind the attack. Wolfowitz's answer: I think the evidence is there for the whole world to see. I think many people in this room watched it live on television, watched the 2 towers of the World Trade Center coming down. If you want evidence, I'll be happy to. Oh, I can't, I guess. The FBI controls it. On September the 28th, 2001, Attorney General John Ashcroft was asked whether the US was able to trace any of the 19 hijackers back to Afghanistan. His response: I don't think I'm capable of answering that question. On October the 2nd, 2001, Rumsfeld was asked, will you be sharing with the leaders you plan to visit any evidence of Osama bin Laden's connection with the 9/11 attacks? He answered, I think that I will not be sharing the evidence. I would be happy to, but I think this has been done amply. The evidence of the attack is on television every day. The linkages between the terrorist networks involved are on television every day. I don't know if we need any more evidence, or do I think that anyone is asking for any more evidence, except the Taliban. Indeed, the Taliban, who said they would give up bin Laden if the US produced such evidence. So the best Wolfowitz, Ashcroft and Rumsfeld can do is offer that the evidence is on TV. Let's continue with the timeline. On October the 2nd, 2001, Blair released the first of his celebrated dossiers. It was entitled Responsibility for the Terrorist Atrocities in the United States. This started off with, this document does not purport to provide a prosecutable case against Osama bin Laden in a court of law. That's not a good start. Colin Powell also promised a white paper from the State Department to establish the authorship of the attacks by Al-Qaeda. It was never forthcoming. On October the 7th, 2001, Bush announced the initiation of the illegal, in my opinion, bombing campaign against Afghanistan. He did not link the country in any way to the events of 9/11. On the same day, the US representative of the UN delivered a letter to the President of the UN Security Council in which he listed the reasons for what he described as US military operations against Afghanistan. This official letter to the highest executive body of the UN did not include evidence linking Afghanistan to 9/11. And then on June 5th, 2006, Ed Haas, who's an independent journalist, contacted the FBI having noticed that the wanted poster for Osama bin Laden posted on the FBI on the website did not mention bin Laden's suspected links to 9/11. Rex Toome, the chief investigative publicity for the FBI, said, the reason why 9/11 is not mentioned on OBL's most wanted page is because the FBI has no hard evidence connecting bin Laden to 9/11. Okay, let's hear what Osama bin Laden first said about the attacks. Here is his interview with Umat, a Pakistani daily published in Karachi on September the 28th, 2001. It was translated into English by the BBC World Monitoring Service and made public on September 29, 2001. I am not involved in the 11th September attacks in the United States. Whoever committed the attack of 11th September are not the friends of the American people. I've already said that we are against the American system, not against the people. Whereas in these attacks, the common American people have been killed. The United States should try to trace the perpetrators of these attacks within itself, the people who are part of the US system. Okay, enough about bin Laden. It's clear there is no evidence linking him to the 9/11 attacks. And if we fast forward 15 years, we now have the so-called principal architect of the attacks, Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, currently in pre-trial at Gitmo. He confessed to being the principal architect after being waterboarded 183 times in 1 month. If I was tortured, I'd probably confess to killing my own brother. Anyway, let's return to the alleged hijackers. On the 14th September, the FBI released the names of 19 individuals whom it identified as hijackers aboard the 4 airliners that crashed on September the 11th. 13 days later, in another press release, the FBI released 19 photographs of the individuals believed to be the hijackers of the 4 planes that crashed on 9/11. Notice these individuals are no longer designated as identified, but merely believed to be the hijackers. Further to that, emphasising the by now tentative nature of the identification, they added the following caveat to the press release. It should be noted that attempts to confirm the true identities of these individuals is still underway. There has been no subsequent press release confirming the true identities of the individuals. The authorities would have us believe that these 19 young men, identified by just their names and photographs, have had their punishment, and we have had our justice, inasmuch as they were killed in the planes along with the passengers and crew. But is there any authenticated evidence than boarding the planes? I've submitted my own freedom of information requests to the FBI, identifying myself as a bereaved family member. Oops, sorry. And yet the FBI has failed to provide any authenticated evidence placing them on any of the flights involved in the attacks. They cannot produce authenticated flight manifests, CCTV stills and video, ticket stubs and check-in staff testimony. The FBI misdirect me to the trial of Zacharias Mazoui, the so-called 20th hijacker. As part of the prosecution's exhibits, there are 4 images. Here's one of them. Purporting to be of Atta and Alomari at Portland, Maine airport. But this is not Boston Logan, where AA-11 took off. We also have this single video and 7 stills with no date, no timestamp, no camera ID, of the 5 alleged hijackers of AA-77, allegedly passing through West Security Checkpoint number 1 at Washington Dulles Airport. That's an amazing 30 frames per second for a security camera, instead of the more typical time-lapse 1 to 4 frames per second. The Dulles video was obtained by the law firm Motley Rice and released by the Associated Press, not by the authorities. Now, the lack of the date, time, camera ID and fast frame rate may just be a feature of the Loronic software used, but all of this doesn't matter, because the gold standard is the flight manifest. They are used routinely in insurance claims when planes crash and people die. The Missouri trial exhibits do not contain any authenticated evidence of the perpetrators boarding the planes, let alone hijacking them. I appealed the FBI misdirection, and they resorted to saying that releasing such evidence would interfere with law enforcement proceedings. 15 years on. I contacted Sean Bentel, the Director of Customer Relations, and Douglas Parker, the CEO of American Airlines, to authenticate the copies of the AA-11 flight manifests which are floating around on the internet. These are issued by Boston Globe and author Pete McDermott, and not by the airline or FBI. Sean Bentel replied to my email, but will not authenticate them. I also contacted Kip Hamilton of American Airlines, who was interviewed on the 13th of September, according to an FBI FD 302 form, submitted a passenger list to the FBI, printed out at 9:07 on September the 11th. None of them will authenticate the scanned images, nor provide authenticated copies. The Boston Globe has not replied to me, and I asked them to release authenticated copy of the flight manifest. In other freedom of information requests I've made to the FBI, they've refused to release several forms of interviews held with 4 ticket agents who purportedly sold tickets to the alleged hijackers. The FBI cites that the release of such information would be an invasion of personal privacy. Anyway, none of this matters because apparently within hours of the attacks, the FBI had identified the 19 probable hijackers, according to a statement by Robert Bonner to the 9/11 Commission. The FBI have all the evidence, physical and digital, of the people who are actually on the planes. Okay. Wait a second, maybe I'm not asking for the right record, or there's a problem with me being a non-US citizen, so I decided to do an experiment. American Airlines 587 crashed on the 12th of November 2001. Barely 2 months after 9/11, 251 passengers lost their lives along with 9 crew. What happens if I submit a freedom of information request for the flight manifest from the same airline in the same year as 9/11? Well, they promptly sent me this. Go figure. We have a situation where the FBI have not produced any fundamental evidence, either in a court of law or via freedom of information request, that any of the 19 alleged hijackers boarded the 4 aircraft and perpetrated the mass murder. As family members, we should have unfettered access to this basic, fundamental evidence. I believe in this case the absence of evidence is synonymous with the evidence of absence. In the case of murder, it is up to a government to prove its accusations. A government that fails for 15 years to prove its accusations in a case of mass murder must be considered as covering up that crime. That's what I accuse the current administration under Obama of doing in a recent letter. What about the findings that the hijackers were part of Al-Qaeda that the coroner concluded? For me, even though the 9/11 Commission report has been widely discredited, not least by those who are actually on the Commission, this entry on page 146 is enough to discredit the major findings of the Commission. It's regarding the sensitive interrogations of alleged Al-Qaeda detainees. The interrogations were not sensitive, I believe harsh is the euphemism used, i.e. torture. The 9/11 Commission were only allowed to review the intelligence reports. They had no control over whether, when, or how questions of particular interest would be asked. They weren't even allowed to talk to the interrogators. Any intelligence officer will tell you that intelligence is the weakest of evidence. It's not under oath, it's no witnesses, often paid for or under blackmail, or in this case, extracted under torture. And these interrogations were absolutely critical in establishing Al-Qaeda's involvement and knowledge of the 9/11 plot, which is obviously an important part of the official narrative. In fact, 25% of the footnotes of the 9/11 Commission report are references to these interrogations. On January the 2nd, 2008, the 9/11 Commission Chair, Keane, and the Vice Chair, Hamilton, published an article in the New York Times entitled "Stonewalled by the CIA," detailing how the CIA obstructed the investigation by not responding to lawful requests for information and later on destroyed 200 hours of videotapes of these interrogations. There's been no justice. The Bush administration has not provided any evidence of Osama bin Laden or the alleged hijackers or Al-Qaeda or links to Afghanistan's involvement in the attacks which killed my brother. The coroner relied on the 9/11 Commission report, which itself does not reference any authenticated evidence placing any of the 19 hijackers on board. It accuses them of being part of Al-Qaeda, and yet we know by the 9/11 Commission's own admission this was only through hearsay evidence extracted under torture, the recordings of which were destroyed. Anyway, over the last 3 years, I've been trying to get the British authorities to take an interest into the uninvestigated crime of the mass murder of 67 Britons. Here are some typical responses from the authorities. The first is from a chief inspector of West Sussex Police. She was visibly shocked when she was shown footage of Building 7 collapsing. Building 7 was the third building to collapse on 9/11, which wasn't hit by a plane. She hadn't even heard of Building 7 and was even more surprised when we told her investigators didn't test for explosives and the evidence was removed from the crime scene almost immediately. However, she took the coward's way out and said, "I very much doubt that the fundamental issues that were reported on that day could have been covered up, as you claim." She recommended I approach the Foreign and Commonwealth Office and my local MP. So I did. I gave the FCO a dozen or so reasons as to why they should question the veracity of the 9/11 Commission report. Miss McCarthy stands by it. Has she even read it? How anyone can stand by the 9/11 Commission report is beyond me. Why is a different question. I met with my local MP, Nick Herbert, and despite the late MP Michael Meacher also speaking with him at length, face-to-face and over the phone on my behalf, Herbert has refused to take on any of the actions I requested, including the easiest, in my opinion, public support, petitioning the Attorney General to re-up my brother's inquest. That's what Herbert said. He hasn't even got the decency to reply to my mother. She wrote to him in December 2014 asking for his support. We are both his constituents. She is still waiting for a reply. All that is necessary for the triumph of evil is that good men do nothing. Maybe I'm being too generous with that adjective. So I formally asked the FCO to request the following from their US counterparts. Authenticated evidence of the alleged hijackers boarding the plane that struck the North Tower, proof of al-Qaeda's involvement in the attacks, formal and positive identification of the wreckage of the plane that struck the North Tower. The flight designated as American Airlines 11 has not been positively identified, i.e. through serial numbers, to any of the wreckage found at the World Trade Center, despite landing gear being found at the corner of West and Rector Street. I also have numerous photos of plane wreckage found on the streets surrounding the World Trade before the towers collapsed. Of course, I've also submitted numerous freedom of information requests to the FBI. And the FBI even admitted in court that it did not identify the wreckage of any of the aircraft involved in the attacks. Remember Lockerbie? We ID'd the plane and reconstructed it in a hangar, just one plane. Also, the flight data recorders recovered from AA-77 and UA-93, for the first time in 20 years of major investigations by the National Transport and Safety Board, did not contain the serial numbers of the data recorders in the report. Hardly standard practice. I also asked for the declassified 28 pages of the joint congressional inquiry. These were actually released last Friday, buried in between Nice and the attempted coup in Turkey. The 28 pages name two key people, Omar al-Bayoumi, likely GID, that's the Saudi intelligence, who had extensive ties with the Saudi government, and Osama Bassan, who received funding from both Prince Bandar, who's a mate of George Bush. Each had contact with two of the alleged AA-77 hijackers, al-Mindar and al-Hamzi. Here is an official White House picture of Prince Bandar meeting with Cheney, Rice, and President Bush on the 13th of September 2001. I know from a freedom of information request that 302 Saudis, including members of the royal family, were flown out on the 13th of September. There is no record of them being questioned. I don't know if it's still scheduled, but tomorrow there was going to be an article in the Sunday Express about the 28 pages covering this. And I've asked our unelected Prime Minister to debate the 28 pages in Parliament. Anyway, the FCO said in my response to my request, "We do not judge it appropriate to follow up further with the US authorities, as you request. This is unacceptable. A government which refuses to produce or even just request such fundamental evidence, nearly 15 years on after the attacks, is at a minimum complicit of covering up the mass murder of nearly 3,000 people, including 67 Britons." And then, back to my brother. Out of the blue, in May 2013, 5 months after the inquest, we had yet another call from the police. Another part of Jeff's remains had been identified, this time his upper arm. These remains had a tag location and were found approximately 20 to 40 metres south of the south side of the North Tower. These are the only remains that have not been repatriated. They are still in New York, held in a repository below ground at the 9/11 Museum. Last December, I started a crowdfunding campaign to allow me to engage a barrister to represent me in my application to reopen my brother's inquest under Section 13(1)(b) of the 1988 Coroners Act. Whether by reason of fraud, rejection of evidence, irregularity of proceedings, insufficiency of inquiry, the discovery of new facts or evidence or otherwise, it is necessary or desirable in the interest of justice that another inquest should be held. I will be applying to the Attorney General for a fresh inquest, citing new evidence along with the insufficiency of inquiry and obviously the absence of evidence. Going for a fresh inquest is something the late Michael Meacher suggested I do after he had spoken with the ex-Attorney General, Dominic Grieve, on my behalf. In September last year, 4 weeks before Michael Meacher died, I had requested a meeting with himself and Jeremy Corbyn, who I know is sympathetic to 9/11 Truth. Alas, I didn't get a reply from Michael and do not know if he'd asked Corbyn for such a meeting. In any case, a barrister is interested in the case, and he wasn't the only one. I approached several. All bloody expensive, though. And we are preparing written submissions and expert testimony, and the goal is to submit the application later on this year. Okay, I would like to spend the remaining time looking at the plane hijackings. So even if the US authorities could produce authenticated evidence of the perpetrators boarding the planes, I do not believe the hijacks of 9/11 were carried out by 4 individual teams of wannabe Al-Qaeda, jihadists, double agents, patsies, or whoever they were. In any case, the alleged hijackers were terrible pilots by all accounts, and plenty of experienced pilots have come forward to say there's no way they flew those planes. So if it wasn't the dastardly 19 Muslim hijackers who hijacked the planes, then who and how? So now I'd like to take a look at a theory which has been put forward by several 9/11 researchers, that of the remote control of the planes, but I'd like to examine it from a slightly different angle. From my research, all evidence points towards the planes being controlled remotely by a single team, who managed each hijack in a controlled, sequential manner. I'll show you what I mean. Let's look at the timeline of the hijacks of the planes. All the flights were scheduled to take off within 25 minutes of each other. We have the takeoff times, the deviation hijack times, and the impact times. And we know the takeoff and impact times fairly accurately. The exact hijack times are hard to ascertain, especially as the 9/11 Commission and NORAD have different timelines. And then we have the deliberate obfuscation and fraud. For example, the 9/11 Commission stated on page 18 of its report that the transponder, that's the gadget on board a plane which responds to a radio frequency interrogation to identify the plane and give its altitude, they said that this transponder on AA11 was switched off at 8:21. However, through a Freedom of Information request, we know this is not the case. It was switched off at 8:13. The last routine response from the pilot was at 8:13 and 31 seconds. 16 seconds later, AA11 failed to respond to another air traffic control command. The plane was hijacked at 8:14, not 8:21. Otherwise, the most reliable indicator of a hijacking process is when it actually deviates from its course. But no matter, the exact times are accurate to within a few minutes. So if you've got 4 individual teams of terrorists who have hijacked the planes, each team would manage its own plane. And once the planes took off, they would not be able to communicate with each other. The airports which the planes took off from are on the East Coast, and the targets are also near the East Coast. So it would make sense for each team to hijack the plane as soon as possible to avoid it being intercepted and fly it to its own target. Instead, we see each plane being flown way off target, heading west for long periods of time, especially the last 2 planes, AA-77 and UA-93. The first plane, AA-11, was hijacked 15 minutes after takeoff. So remember, each target is near the East Coast, near from where the plane took off. So there's no reason why hijackers wouldn't do something similar for each of the other planes, especially as once the first hijack starts, the risk of being intercepted increases. So let's say each plane should deviate or be hijacked within 15 minutes after takeoff. 1 or 2 minutes of difference is meaningless. The probable graphic of the hijack timeline would have looked like this. All the hijacks and impacts of the targets should have occurred by approximately 9:10 in the morning. Instead, we have them carrying on for nearly another hour. So instead of 15 minutes between each takeoff and each hijack, the actual times between the takeoff and hijack are 15, increases to 28, increases to 34, and then a staggering 53 minutes. Nothing is similar between all planes. AA-11 was hijacked at 8:14. UA-175 was hijacked at 8:42, 4 minutes before AA-11 impacted the North Tower. AA-77 was hijacked at 8:54, 9 minutes before UA-175 impacted the South Tower. UA-93 was hijacked at 9:35, 3 minutes before AA-77 impacted the Pentagon. The gap between each flight deviation and previous impact is 4, 9, and 3 minutes. It's almost as if the operators had finalised the last autonomous minutes of the flight, and only then did they start to hijack the next one. I think the one flight to look at, which is interesting, is the last flight, the UA93. It was delayed by 42 minutes. That's 41 minutes after taxiing. If there really were terrorists inside that plane, they would have said, we are too late, our colleagues on the other planes have probably finished their work, we should hijack as soon as possible. Instead, they waited a staggering 53 minutes after takeoff, much longer than anyone else. And this deviation happened at 9:35, 3 minutes before the Pentagon impact at 9:38. For me, this pattern is not consistent with a four-team operation. It's not a random sequence. It's a sequence consistent with a single team operation overseeing the hijacks in a very controlled, sequential manner. We just look at this. This is obviously the actual sequence. We just pop back to the previous page. That's what it would have been like, in my opinion, if there were 4 independent teams. Okay, I've nearly come to the end of my allocated time. I started questioning 9/11 back in October 2001 after an awake friend forwarded me an article by John Pilger called "This War is a Farce." I've obviously been looking at 9/11 for a long time. Along with the absence of evidence and truth from the US government, I would caution you that there is a lot of misinformation and deliberate disinformation out there regarding 9/11 truth. I'm of the opinion nearly all the major truth groups have been infiltrated at some point, and some from the outset. I trust only a handful of people read 9/11. These are mainly polymath friends over 20 years. That said, the best technical study of the attacks, in my opinion, can be found at peace911.org. And the Davidson book is superbly researched, relying mainly on FBI records and the lack of. I mean, you can find all the so-called FBI FD302 forms, which are sort of typewritten summary of an interview with people, but it's not the actual interview isn't recorded. So you're totally relying on whatever the FBI produce in a typewritten report. Yeah, the 9/11 film Incontrovertible can be found there. I think it's had approximately about 1 million views across the various duplicated channels and stuff. There's also Press for Truth, which is a film documenting the fight the families had to create the 9/11 Commission. It took 441 days for the US government to investigate the mass murder of 3,000 people, and Bush first appointed Henry Kissinger as the head of the 9/11 Commission. They initially only allocated $3 million. Compare this with the $50 million spent investigating Clinton's sexual exploits. That tells us all we need to know about them not wanting 9/11 to be investigated. At this point, I was going to say, follow me on Twitter and consider supporting my legal fight. I decided today that I'm not going to be doing this anymore. I found that under the Coroner's Act, I mean, almost anyone can actually petition the Attorney General for a new inquest. You just need to put your case forward. I'm still working with the guy, and the funds that we've already raised are to help £750 an hour, God bless, for the barrister. So the monies will still be used for that, but I have to stop. It's not so much this. I quite enjoy this. It's that internal dialogue that's just going on all the time, when I should be spending time maybe daydreaming, just thinking, oh, what's my 7-year-old doing now at school? I'm daydreaming and thinking about freedom of information requests or some bloody weird thing that the authorities haven't responded on. I'm just sick of it. It's very draining, and yeah, I need to kind of move on. But
Well done, Matt. Matt Campbell. Thank you very much indeed.